Today, we stand with our brothers in Burkina Faso to seal a $12 billion wheat and sesame partnership. This is not just an agreement, it is a shared vision for food security, growth, and friendship.
The pen hovered over the paper. Cameras clicked. Saudi officials in crisp white thobes leaned forward, their eyes fixed on the man in the green beret, Ibrahim. Burkina Faso's young and unshakable leader pressed the tip to the dotted line. In that single motion, a $12 billion agricultural empire was set into motion. Wheat, sesame, billions in export value. The deal was more than a trade agreement, it was a statement to the world. Burkina Faso was no longer just a consumer of the world's food. It was becoming one of the world's suppliers. But this wasn't supposed to happen. Not here. Not now. And certainly not in a landlocked country that just years ago relied on foreign aid for basic staples. So, how did a nation with more history of drought than abundance manage to sign one of the largest food export deals Africa has ever seen? To understand that, we have to start with the seed of it all literally, and it's not what you think. Before wheat and sesame came into the picture, the Saudis had already tested the waters with Burkina Faso's agricultural potential. In early meetings, the talk wasn't about billion-dollar grain empires, it was about soybeans. The $2.6 billion soybean agreement between the two countries raised eyebrows across the continent. Why soybeans? Because in a warming world, Saudi Arabia needed crops it couldn't grow easily at home, and Burkina Faso, despite its size, was emerging as a surprisingly efficient producer. 4. It was the perfect first strike in a bigger plan, proved to foreign buyers that Burkina Faso could deliver at scale. The soybean deal was the pebble thrown into the pond, but the ripples? They were much larger. In Riyadh's gleaming conference halls, the conversations quickly expanded. If Burkina Faso could scale soybeans, what about high-value crops like sesame? What about wheat, the very grain the Saudis import in massive quantities every year? And here's where the story turns. Because the next deal on the table would be 10 times bigger. On paper, it was ambitious to the point of madness. A $12 billion export pipeline, wheat and sesame flowing out of Burkina Faso to feed the Gulf. Most countries would take decades to build the infrastructure for that kind of operation. But E's pitch was different. He wasn't asking Saudi Arabia to buy the dream. He was asking them to help build it. The deal wasn't just about handing over crops, it included investments in irrigation, grain storage facilities, and modern processing plants in Ouagadougou and Bobo Dioulasso. Saudi capital would meet. Land and labor. In return, Saudi Arabia would secure a reliable, politically aligned supplier of staple foods. Critics called it a gamble. Supporters called it genius. But either way, the ink was on the page. Still, to grasp the significance of this leap, you have to understand where Burkina Faso was just a few short years ago. The story of Burkina Faso's food transformation starts in scarcity. For decades, the country's name was almost synonymous with drought reports and hunger relief campaigns. The sales-shifting climate punished farmers, while reliance on imported wheat made the nation vulnerable to price shocks. When global wheat prices spiked after geopolitical crises abroad, Burkina Faso's bakeries went silent. Bread and everyday staple became scarce overnight. Foreign aid shipments, from Russia to the EU, became lifelines. But saw a flaw in that dependency. As a young officer rising through the ranks, he had traveled to rural regions where farmers were already experimenting with drought-resistant wheat strains and sesame that thrived in poor soil. The problem wasn't capacity, it was coordination. By the time he took power, the goal was clear. Burkina Faso would stop being a client of other nations' grain and start being a competitor. But achieving that meant more than planting crops. It meant building a system capable of scaling them for the world market. And the turning point in that transformation didn't happen in a farm field, it happened in a Riyadh boardroom. Saudi Arabia's interest in African agriculture isn't charity, it's strategy. The kingdom imports nearly all of its wheat, and its population is growing. Global supply chains have been under strain, and Saudi planners have been quietly looking for reliable partners in regions that can produce large harvests with relatively low production costs. Burkina Faso was an unlikely candidate at first, but as military-backed government projected something that many African governments couldn't stability in decision-making. For the Saudis, that meant fewer political roadblocks to long-term agricultural projects. The $12 billion deal was structured to be mutually binding. Saudi Arabia gets secure grain and sesame supply lines. Burkina Faso gets infrastructure and guaranteed buyers. But knew better than to rely on a single buyer forever, which is why the sesame piece of the deal is more important than most people realize. Sesame might not sound as glamorous as wheat, but in the global market, it's a quiet goldmine. Used in everything from tahini to high-end cooking oils, it commands a high price per ton, and Burkina Faso's organic sesame is in rising demand. In the last decade, the country has climbed the ranks of Africa's sesame exporters, competing with Sudan, Ethiopia, and Nigeria. The difference: Burkina Faso's sesame industry has been shifting toward certified organic production, which opens premium export markets in Europe and the Middle East. For the Saudis, sesame imports from Burkina Faso diversify their agricultural partnerships. 4. Sesame is the crop that gives him bargaining power. It's niche enough to keep prices high, but versatile enough to pair with large-scale wheat exports. But here's the twist. This deal isn't just about economics. It could reshape the agricultural balance of power in Africa. A $12 billion deal sounds like a golden ticket, but the road ahead isn't smooth. Climate volatility still threatens harvests. Infrastructure projects can stall. Political opponents both inside and outside Burkina Faso are watching for any sign of failure. Then there's the question of dependency. Yes, the deal brings in foreign investment, but it also means a large chunk of Burkina Faso's agricultural output will be tied to one major buyer. If that buyer ever changes course, the ripple effects could be painful. E's answer to that is diversification. Even as wheat and sesame dominate the headlines, Burkina Faso is quietly investing in other cash crops, from cashews to mangoes, aiming to turn the country into a full-spectrum agricultural exporter. And that leads us to the question everyone's asking: is this a one-time windfall, or the first chapter in a long-term agricultural empire? When Ibrahim set down his pen in Riyadh, the cameras captured a moment, but what they didn't capture was the years of planning, risk-taking, and quiet agricultural revolutions behind it. A nation once defined by scarcity is now writing a new identity, one shipment of grain, one bag of sesame at a time. Whether the $12 billion deal becomes a lasting legacy or a cautionary tale will depend on how well Burkina Faso navigates the storms ahead. But one thing is certain: the world is watching. And for the first time in a long time, they're watching Burkina Faso not as a recipient of the world's harvest, but as a grower feeding it.